Hi, I want to make a quick video on the idea of your subconscious and your conscious mind, those that arbitrary distinction we make, and how every little thing that we see out of the corner of our eye, every little thing that we hear, even though we don't consciously recognize it at the moment, it has an effect on everything we do. And subconsciously, anything that we, from this point of view, from this mechanism, this body, this neurology, experiencing something, I'm seeing something outside of myself. I'm seeing things out of the corner of my eye. I'm looking at the camera right now, but I'm seeing things out of the corner of my eye. And when I focus on the camera, I lose, and then I start not only focusing on the camera, from my sense of sight, from my point of view of seeing the camera, and then I start not paying attention to anything on the outside of myself. So, or say an ambulance goes by the window, if there's a window right next to me, and then the ambulance, I wasn't even aware of it. I was aware of the sirens, but I wasn't aware of the ambulance actually going by. But somehow, say in the dream I have tonight, or something like that, then I start dreaming about an ambulance. I see the ambulance, and I see the ambulance exactly the same way. The ambulance is parked down the street. I somehow see it, and then is parked down the street. Say the ambulance stopped, hypothetically speaking, and the ambulance stopped, and I remember it in my dream, and I say that looks exactly like the ambulance that I saw in my dream, even though I just saw it out of the corner of my eye. So your mind recognizes a lot of things subconsciously. So subconsciously, your mind can pick up all sorts of details that you don't recognize, and sometimes in a way, it comes to controls our conscious way of thinking. So all these little subconscious little things that we recognize and see control our conscious form of thought. But in a way, in many cases, when we consciously think about something, we justify it using our subconscious thought processes. So in a way, we recognize our subconscious in a way. Our subconscious thought processes that control us, not only from our senses, but from our subconscious evolutionary points of view that we have, or evolutionary things that we have, pre-built-in mechanisms that control us subconsciously, evolutionary things and such and so forth and whatnot. Things like that control us subconsciously, that control the way we think and the things we do, what we find attractive, all sorts of things like that. And we use those as, and we almost in a way consciously we recognize these things consciously. We can put words to these things, but we don't necessarily understand necessarily all the details of these things. And subconscious comes more down to senses and recognizing all these things around you. But subconsciously, predispositions and things like that we have based on previous experiences and genetic predispositions that we have based on a predisposition of us existing. A genetic predisposition only exists because you happen to exist from someone that already existed based on their genetic predispositions and the things how they treated themselves based on their lives and all sorts of things. So a genetic predisposition is just something beyond your control before you were born, and how there was not just genetic predispositions, but predispositions that existed from the circumstances that happen, and everything's a circumstantial predisposition because the circumstances of your very existence are circumstantial, and how things happen to you and interact with you. It's something that happened to your parent could have affected you in their lifetime, even though it wasn't necessarily genetic, but it's just circumstantial. Everything is circumstantial. Your existence, the fact that you came out of this human being, the fact that you were the sperm and the egg that made the mixture, the sperm that made you the mixture, and how you were the mixture based on those interactions. It's all circumstantial, and genetic is just based on the biology. We're just predisposed to all sorts of things, and that comes down to the subconscious and these predispositions that we have evolutionarily speaking, based on initial cell reproducing and causing this kind of function that have self-propelling function that seems to have moderately over time, from a course of beginning to where it is now, to when evolution stopped, at least for human beings, and manipulated and changed and started to change over time. And it became more fine, and it became the function became more fine and more distinct and more detailed, and everything we do is a little more detailed because we eat in a certain way, we do things a certain way. It became more detailed and separate and distinct from all these other creatures that exist and keep evolving, and that's exactly what's happening. It started to separate, and the distinctions became finer and finer and finer between us and everyone else. Every other distinction, even between different human beings. Doesn't matter about anything else, but just the fact that you're a different individual from someone else. There's distinctions. The way you look, superficial things mostly that mean anything. It's a practical function of you being able to eat and defecate and subconsciously reproduce. Like when you're subconsciously having sex, it's about subconsciously reproducing, even though the function of having an orgasm and finding sex satisfying is because it's not that it's making you want to have children. It's that you find sex satisfying, and that's what makes you end up fooling you to have children. So sex is based on an ignorant mechanism, which led us to where we are now, based on ignorant mechanism controlling people in the past and animals in the past. It's because it wanted to fool us. It's a mechanism that wanted to reproduce, and that reproduction, it needed to find some way to manipulate the creature, the sentient being, to reproduce, and they use that. They use the satisfaction that we find in sex and things like that, and use that as a fooling mechanism. When we're having sex, it's not fooling us into having kids. It's fooling us into having kids. It's not the kids, the conscious wanting to have kids, that's controlling our sexual desires. It's the why do you think it feels good? Because it's trying to get us to have kids based on a mechanism that happened to function in a certain way and manipulate in a certain way and morph into a certain way to allow us to and to allow the way the reproduction to happen a certain way based on different variables in the past that caused us to interact in certain ways, and the interaction led to things like orgasm and finding sexual sex and things like that satisfying. And that's where we've led to us where we are now, and that's the satisfaction, satisfying these desires, because it's a satisfaction mechanism. There has to be some kind of satisfaction. The satisfaction is, say, relief, sexual relief, or whatever it is, or satisfying hunger, or whatever it may be. But sex is a better example in the underlying subconscious mechanism of controlling you and how you're functioning in relationship to the environment, and how everything beyond your control seems to be subconscious, because everything around us, from our point of view, has a control on us. It has control on us, and the control means something because we're sentient and we're interacting and we're reacting. And the sentient means something and has meaning because we react based on these feelings that we have, based on the sentience that we have, and interacting with the environment. So that's what gives the function its meaning, is this interaction, this reflexive interaction and reacting to things. So the mechanism created, based on the mechanism creating a desire mechanism that allowed us to have, based on a mechanism that manipulated over time, that changed over time, allowed us to have satisfying sexual, it changed and morphed, and it evolved into something to where it was satisfying sexual desires to create, based on for human beings and other creatures that require two sexes to reproduce, that's how the function worked. A function led to something, it led to a desire mechanism that allowed us to satisfy desire, constantly reproducing desire, that constantly made us want the desire, a redundant desire. And the desire is the thing that causes to fool us into reproducing, to do the same process over and over again. So it's not the reproduction making us want to have sex, it's the satisfaction that we get based on the function that allowed us to have, it's the subconscious. So yes. It's the function of fooling us, and the thinking and the desire that is fooling us to have kids, that's the fooling us to reproduce, but that in itself could have initially come from the mechanism allowing reproduction to begin with. So it is all subconscious in a way, but it's the fooling mechanism of us wanting to satisfy our sexual desires and our buildup of sexual desires to make us want to reproduce. And it's not the other way around. It's not subconsciously wanting to have kids, therefore we're going to sexually gratify ourselves to have kids. No, it's the sexual gratification that makes us the foolest to have kids. So maybe an evolutionary mechanism, but not a subconscious mechanism, and say in your mind, because that's something you could recognize fully and thoroughly, unless you actually want to have kids. And if you consciously want to have kids and you recognize that, then it's something at least subconsciously comes out of the top of your mind, that you recognize that you want. And then maybe that's conscious then. It's a conscious form of thought that you bring to the surface and you recognize. Otherwise, if you don't want to have kids, when you have sex, you don't subconsciously want to have kids. Or even if you just masturbate or something, you don't subconsciously want to have kids. You're just consciously satisfying the desires that you recognize you have based on a buildup of a mechanism of springs pulling in your system, and things being pulled and tensions being pulled, and you want to satisfy those tensions. And that's the very thing that makes us want to satisfy it, to fool us into doing something, and of thinking that our hand is a vagina or something, or whatever it may be. And then, it's a mechanism that the fact that we can oversee it now, we recognize that the self-conscious mechanism, that the subconscious mechanism didn't actually exist in the same way that we actually thought it was. It was actually not as thorough as we necessarily thought it was, and the mechanism was basically satisfy a desire that was trying to fool us to begin with, an evolutionary desire based on a self-building mechanism that happens to be based on a foundation that existed, and that's where we are now. And it's a foundation of getting us to fool us to reproduce, to allow us to live, to have all these negative side effects of not you need to survive, so it takes a long time for you to die if you don't eat. So it's we need to eat to survive, to not suffer, and then we need in the meantime we need to try our best to satisfy our reproductive goals or whatever it may be, and then we die, and then we're replaced by the next generation, and so on and so forth. So yes, onto the subconscious thing though. A lot of times in our subconscious, another aspect of subconscious understanding is subconsciously, we consciously recognize these things, and based on a lot of the times it's based on these social standards and understanding what we find so screwed up, or what we find effed up or fucked up, is based on these societal standards that we have, and understanding how everything functions around us. And so we find this effed up, but it's based on a societal standard that we have. And necessarily, not to say that society is always wrong, but in many cases we find something and we reinforce that belief, and we self-propel that belief, and we become part of that belief, that migration, that mob mentality of thinking a certain way based on that belief, and thinking that something's wrong, even though from a point of view we don't necessarily know if something's wrong. We just sort of, it's a meme that turns into a trend, that turns into an idea to live by, and that's an idea that we reinforce when we start having these ideas, and we start reinforcing ideas based on culture and things like that, and how culture is different all around the world, and it's not necessarily the same for your culture, it is for someone else's culture, or whatever you want, your living conditions, and what you believe, and what people around you believe in certain circumstances and certain geographic locations. And a lot of the times we consciously, we understand our subconscious and all these little things, or these what we call subconscious, and we understand the function of it, but we consciously rationalize and rationalize what we we do and don't like, and we rationalize these things part of our subconscious point of view, and we find ways to describe them. We can find ways to find what we would call subconscious, to make a distinction, if we both understand that it's conscious. Making the distinction seems kind of silly in describing it this way, but we can understand that in many ways we describe consciously what we say subconsciously, but everything is happening subconsciously. When I say a word, even if I think a thought, it's coming from somewhere else. It's coming from something else, and it's coming from a subconscious point of view. It's coming from an interaction happening beyond my control, and that's exactly the thing that's beyond my control. And so everything in a way is subconscious. It's a deterministic mechanism that's controlling every aspect of our existence, every aspect of our thought in our existence. And it's controlling everything we think and how we think. And it's just an interaction. Thinking is just an interaction causing another interaction. It's a linear interaction based on the linear interactions of the deterministic mechanism, that mechanism that we live in. The linear, real reality that we're living in. We're interacting in the real world all the time, regardless of if we're hallucinating or whatever it may be. We're interacting in the real world all the time, and it doesn't matter if we're not describing it right. We're living in the real world, and we're living by the logic every moment of our lives. It's just understanding the distinction between understanding sentience and those distinctions, and understanding the way reality works. And when it comes to the sentience and making the best for the sentience, that's where this intelligence thing comes from. Not making it only better for ourselves, but for recognizing that we need to make it better for others and everyone else, ourselves and everyone else. What makes it best for everyone creates the least amount of suffering. That's where the distinction, and making it important for us, understanding where we are and what means something to us and what means something to someone else, and that's what means something. And that's where the understanding of it from our point of view means something, because we can make the difference because we're inside this game, controlling this game from the inside out. So yes, subconsciously we see things, we understand things, we can consciously recognize these things, sort of like sex in a way, and we can recognize these things, and we can consciously rationalize things. We even at that point it's conscious. We consciously have these things because it comes to our conscious point of view when we recognize these things. Even if we don't subconsciously know the reason, we consciously recognize what we're doing. We can consciously recognize the side effects of something. We can the consequences of something. We could recognize all sorts of things like that. and we can recognize these things, and we rationalize and understand things subconsciously. And we can use, even though if we change, we have different reasons for understanding something consciously from our subconscious point of view. We are describing something that's we're describing something that was coming to our conscious point of view to begin with. So even if it was subconscious, we can consciously rationalize or explain something that was coming from some kind of subconscious point of view, and recognizing it from a different point of view consciously and rationalizing it from that point of view. Even if we don't necessarily know the objective, we don't necessarily know the way things originally were intended, we understand something that's going on, and we can rationalize and understand that consciously based on a subconscious thought process leading to a conscious thought to begin with, because that's where our conscious thoughts come from. Because when we're not focusing on something, we're focusing on, or not focusing on the corner of our eye, we're focusing on the center of our eye, and we understand that something that's happening outside of us, from out of the corner of our eye, beyond our necessarily focus or our awareness, can have some effect on us regardless of our understanding. And something can have an effect on us, everything has an effect on us, not just from our point of view, but things beyond our point of view. And that, surprises, things beyond our point of view have just as much of an effect on us than our point of view have any effect on us. So things outside of our control have just as much an effect. And subconscious is beyond our control because it's a deterministic mechanism controlling us to begin with. But that doesn't mean we can't take responsibility for ourselves. And because we're still within the game and we're moving forward and we're still responsible, or we can still shift the blame to someone that is responsible inside of this game, but it's the game itself that causes the... there's no one to blame in the game. The game is existing in and of itself, and we can't do anything about the game. The game is to blame to begin with, because it's the initial cause that caused any of this to be possible. But there's no one to blame, and it's the circumstance. In many cases, when you're confused and angry, you want to find someone to blame, but you can't find anyone to blame. And the circumstance is the only one to blame. You can't find them to be angry with. You can't put your finger on it, but you want to be angry at someone. And the someone is the circumstance, but you can't put your hand on the circumstance. You can only put your hand on the whatever thing was part of the circumstance and find some way to get mad at it. And that's the only thing we can touch. We can't touch the circumstance. We can only touch the things in the circumstance. And that's sometimes what we're trying to do, is fight the circumstance. But we can't. It's intangible. We want to find something to wring the neck of when we can't, in many cases. And understanding the peculiarities of existence. And that's exactly what we're trying to fight, is the existence that we're existing on. So even though it's something we may call as subconscious, we can consciously recognize it and rationalize these things and say, well, this is why I'm doing something, and I can rationally understand, consciously recognize things such as sex, and I can consciously recognize things that I didn't necessarily think of, and describing a situation that was subconscious, that I didn't necessarily understand a concept, and I consciously rationalized, and I realized that came into my conscious point of view, and it was a subconscious that led to that conscious point of view, and the conscious point of view explained the subconscious through rationalizations and things that we recognize anyway. So I didn't explain that as good as I wanted to, but I got the point across. So sorry for the long video, and until next time, bye.